The crack of splitting wood echoed across the firing range as Instructor Sergeant Kyle Morrison brought his boot down hard on the old rifle stock. The vintage M1 Garand, polished to perfection and carried through 2 wars, lay broken in pieces on the concrete. 68-year-old James Fletcher stood silent, his weathered hands hanging at his sides, watching the weapon his father had carried in Korea shatter into kindling. The 20 young recruits gathered around the range went silent, their eyes darting between the destroyed rifle and the old man whose only crime had been asking to qualify. Alongside them, before we dive deeper into this powerful story, I need to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you from the United States, Pakistan, India, the UK, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your country name in the comments because this story is touching hearts all around the world. And if you want to see how this unfolds, hit that like button right now. Because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Morrison had been running the county's volunteer marksmanship program for 3 years like his own personal kingdom. At 32, he was a decorated marksman himself, with medals from various competitions lining his office wall. But something about James Fletcher's quiet confidence had bothered him from the moment the old man arrived that morning. James had been polite when he'd asked if he could participate in the qualification course. He'd explained that he used to shoot competitively decades ago and wanted to see if he still had it. Morrison had looked at the elderly man with his silver hair and slight tremor and had laughed. He'd made a show of inspecting the M1 Garand, calling it a museum piece, questioning whether it was even safe to fire. Then he'd stomped it into pieces. The young recruits gasped. They'd been learning to respect firearms and the people who carried them. This violated everything Morrison had taught them. But he wasn't done. He turned to James with a smirk and said that if the old man thought he could shoot, he was welcome to try with a real rifle. He tossed his own custom AR-15 at James's feet, a weapon worth more than $3,000. The challenge was clear. Qualify with Morrison's rifle or leave in humiliation. James bent slowly and picked up the weapon. His hands, which had trembled moments before, were suddenly steady. He examined the rifle with practiced expertise. The recruits watched as something shifted in the old man's posture. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set, and when he looked up at Morrison, there was something in his eyes that made the younger man's smile falter. The qualification course was standard. 10 rounds at 50 yards, 10 at 100, and 10 at 200. Possible score was 300 points, with anything above 270 considered expert level. Morrison had scored 289 the previous month. He'd made sure everyone knew it. As James walked to the firing line, Morrison announced loudly that he'd be surprised if the old man could even hit the target. James took his position. He didn't rush. He checked the weapon, tested the trigger pull, adjusted the sight picture. The recruits had gone completely silent. Morrison stood with his arms crossed, his expression amused and contemptuous. The first shot rang out. Then another. And another. James fired with mechanical precision, his breathing controlled, each trigger pull smooth and deliberate. At 50 yards, all 10 shots formed a group you could cover with a quarter. The recruit running the spotting scope called out in amazement. 10 hits, all in the X-ring. Perfect score. Now, pause right here for just a moment. Can you imagine what's going through Morrison's mind right now? Can you feel the shift happening on that range? Drop a comment below telling me what you think happens next. And if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button right now because we bring you the most inspiring real-life stories. Every single week. At 100 yards, James continued his performance. The old man's body had found a rhythm that transcended age. Each shot was a meditation, a return to muscle memory carved over decades. 10 more perfect hits. The recruits were now watching in complete silence, their respect growing with each shot. Some had pulled out their phones, recording something extraordinary. Morrison's face had turned red. He stepped forward and demanded to check the rifle, suggesting something must be wrong with the targets. But the range master, a retired Marine named Garcia, called down that everything was legitimate. Morrison had no choice but to let the course continue. The 200-yard shots were where most shooters struggled. Morrison's own qualification had seen him drop points here. James took his time at this distance. He seemed to be reading the air itself, watching the grass sway, feeling the breeze. Then he settled into position and began to fire. 10 shots. 10 hits, every single one in the center ring. When the final score was tallied, James Fletcher had shot a perfect 300. Not a single point lost. In 30 years of running qualification courses, Garcia had never seen anything like it. The recruits erupted in applause, gathering around James as he carefully set Morrison's rifle down and began to walk away. Morrison, his face purple with rage, shouted after him. He demanded to know who James thought he was. That's when Garcia climbed down from the tower and walked over. He put a hand on Morrison's shoulder and said that perhaps the instructor should have done his research before destroying another man's property and reputation. Garcia explained what he recognized the moment James walked onto the range. James Fletcher wasn't just some old man who used to shoot competitively. He was a legend. In the 70s and 80s, James had been one of the top competitive shooters in the entire country, a member of the U.S. shooting team and a multiple gold medalist in international competitions. He'd set records that stood for years. The tremor in his hand wasn't from age alone, but from shrapnel still lodged near his wrist from Vietnam, where he'd served as a sniper. The rifle Morrison had destroyed had been his father's. Yes, but it had also been a piece of history. Used in competition and in war, worth far more than the fancy custom rifle James had just used. The range went silent. James had stopped walking and turned back. Morrison stood frozen, the reality crashing down on him. In front of all his students, he'd destroyed a priceless piece of history and humiliated a genuine American hero. All because of his own insecurity. James walked back slowly. The recruits parted to let him through. When he stood face to face with Morrison, everyone expected anger. Instead, James spoke quietly. He said that he'd come to the range not to show off, but to remember. The rifle had been his last link to his father and to a time when his hands were steady. Morrison had taken that from him out of nothing more than petty pride, but then James did something unexpected. He told Morrison that the performance he'd just given wasn't about revenge. It was about showing those young recruits something important. He wanted them to see that skill isn't about having the fanciest equipment or the loudest voice. It's about discipline, practice, respect, and humility. He wanted them to learn what Morrison had failed to teach them. That you honor the people who came before you, you respect the tools of your trade, and you never assume you're the best person in any room. James picked up the pieces of his broken rifle, nodded to the recruits, and walked off the range. Morrison never apologized that day, but by the next week, he'd been removed from his position. The recruits had filed formal complaints, backed by Garcia's report. The community had heard the story, and Morrison's reputation was finished. 6 months later, James received a package. Inside was a fully restored M1 Garand, rebuilt with period-correct parts. The note was brief. It was from Morrison, and it simply said, "I'm sorry. I'm learning." Attached was a photo of Morrison at a new range, teaching with a different attitude, with a framed picture of James on the wall. A reminder of the lesson he'd learned the hard way. This story teaches us something powerful about respect and the danger of pride. James Fletcher could have walked away when his rifle was destroyed, but instead he chose to teach a lesson those young recruits will carry forever. Real excellence doesn't need to announce itself. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that we should never judge people by their appearance, then please hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of quiet dignity. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Drop your story below because your experience might inspire someone else today. Until next time, remember that respect is earned through action, not arrogance, and true masters never need to prove themselves until the moment demands it.